Hey, welcome to day 6 of Holy Week and our examinations of what happened each day, our summaries of what happened each day. And today brings us to one of the most important days of the week, Good Friday, which is kind of an odd title for today because the events of today, um, from the perspective of many involved in the story, were not good at all, and certainly for Jesus. But we call it good because the events of this day are the ground on which all of us can come before God and not be afraid of our sin, but be free to confess it, to admit it, to bring it before Him so that He can forgive it, so that He can show His mercy. Today is good because it is the greatest display of love ever shown by God to us. Now, with that said, today's summary is going to include some details about what happens to Jesus that might be unpleasant or uncomfortable. So I would ask you to consider that as we continue looking at it together. But I tell these details because for me, to see the truth and the detail of the experience that Jesus went through opens my eyes to see what kind of man He was, what kind of God He is. It transforms what happened for me that Friday. And I want to say as well, if you feel downcast or discouraged by these, I don't want you to feel bad about that. We should grieve. Good Friday, as good as it is for us, is a time to grieve the suffering of Jesus. So with that said, let's take a look at what happened on Friday. So as we left off on Thursday, we know that Jesus went to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. Probably into the early hours of Friday is when Judas arrived with the temple guards and some Roman soldiers, and Jesus was taken. Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Peter struck out at the guards, but Jesus instructed him to stop. And with that, all the disciples left him. He was escorted, probably with acts of torment and abuse by the temple guards, to an illegal trial set up by his enemies. They were seeking to pin a charge on him so that they could bring him before Pilate and have him executed. Now, they will go on to say this to Pilate, but it was against their law to put someone to death, and so they needed Pilate to do it. But they had already decided in their hearts that Jesus needed to die. So throughout the early hours of Friday, very early in Friday, Jesus endured accusations by those who claimed he was possessed, that claimed he did the work of Satan. He was struck and mocked by those religious leaders that he was brought before. At one point, he was struck for speaking and answering the high priest's question. But ultimately, it came down to a moment that's recorded in Matthew's gospel where the high priest asks him this question. As Jesus keeps silent to the false accusations, the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said it, Jesus told him, but I tell you in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his robes and said, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? See now, you've heard the blasphemy. What is your decision? And they answered, he deserved death. Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others slapped him. So Jesus is confronted by a question. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, yes. He answers truthfully. And he's accused of blasphemy. And so the religious leaders then take him to see Pilate. Now, one detail before we move on. During this trial, 2 disciples of Jesus had followed behind, John and Peter. And they were unable to enter the temple gates, but John, who was a friend of the high priest, was able to get them both access to the courtyard outside of where this trial was happening. And in that courtyard, Peter was confronted 3 times by different people asking if he was a disciple of Jesus. And as Jesus had predicted at the Last Supper, Peter denies him at each turn. and says, "No, I don't know him. I don't know him." And just as well as Jesus predicted, as he denies him the third time, a rooster crows. And we're told that Peter ran away and wept bitterly, knowing that he'd failed Jesus, even when he promised him he wouldn't. So Jesus is taken to Pilate. After being charged with blasphemy by the Sanhedrin, they now needed Pilate to sign off on an execution, in particular, a crucifixion. So Pontius Pilate is brought out and is initially unconvinced by the charges. Jesus is sentenced to a scourging to try and satiate the crowd's demand that he be punished. A Roman scourging was a horrific practice. The offender would be shackled naked most times to a post, or at least stripped down to just underwear. And then they were whipped repeatedly with a flagrum. Now, the flagrum consisted of leather straps that at the end of which were shards of pot, bone, and metal. And as they were whipped with the flagrum, the Romans intended this to cause maximum damage to their victim. And so it would dig in to the back of the offender and tear away flesh and muscle. Many would die from scourging because of how severe the injuries sustained were. Jesus, however, survived this torture and was sent back to Pilate. Each Passover, Pilate would commute the sentence of one of his prisoners, especially the sentence of death. And so, continuing to be unconvinced by the charges, Pilate attempted again to get this off of his case by saying, "Each year I release a prisoner to you, and I ask of you, which do you want released to you, Jesus or Barabbas?" Now, Barabbas was a known revolutionary. He was most likely a terrorist, a zealot, and we know that he was in prison for killing people. And the crowds, upon given this choice, cry out for Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. So I want you to notice in this moment that a guilty man is set free because of the innocent one who is being put to death. A foreshadowing of what all of these events are really about. After multiple unlawful tries being passed around Jewish authorities, visiting Herod, who himself was unconvinced, he was sentenced to death by crucifixion by Pilate, who washed his hands of the whole matter, seeing that the crowd couldn't be satisfied. A crucifixion was one of the most horrible and disgraceful methods of capital punishment. It's said in the Bible that cursed is he who hangs on a tree. And so for Jews in particular, it was a cursed death. It was saved only for non-Roman citizens because it was so horrible that Romans didn't want to inflict this on their own citizens. Before Christ was led away, soldiers spit on him, tormented him, and mocked him. And they created a crown of thorns, which they forced down on his head. Would have caused more bleeding on his scalp. And Jesus already suffering from multiple wounds from the scourging and the beatings he's endured. Jesus, like most victims of crucifixion, was forced to carry his own cross to Calvary. Usually it would have been the crossbeam, not the actual full cross as sometimes we see in a movie. Most likely it was just the bar that sat at the top of the post. The post would often remain in place as a way of being more efficient with crucifixion. They would just be pulled down, the posts left, and each victim would just carry the crossbeam. But I don't want you to be misled by this. Just because he wasn't carrying the entire cross that we normally think of, that crossbeam alone would have been the size of a railroad cross tie. In a healthy condition, it would have been a challenge to carry this, and he would have had to carry it for at least a couple of miles, traveling from the city to the outskirts to where he would be crucified. Colossal beam of wood on his bleeding, bruised, beaten back. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Jesus collapsed. And along the way, he was further mocked and insulted. People on the city streets would gather to mock the victims of crucifixion, to laugh at them, to jeer at them, to shout insults at them. When Jesus collapsed, Simon of Cyrene was pulled by the Roman soldiers from the crowd to help carry Christ's cross with him. So Simon and Cyrene and the battered Jesus now continue dragging that crossbeam all the way to Golgotha. Upon reaching that hill, the Roman soldiers nailed him onto the wooden cross. They would have nailed him through the wrist here so that the bones of his arm would help bear the weight of him on the cross so that it wouldn't tear out. 7 to 9 inch iron spikes would have been driven through some of the most sensitive nerve centers of the body, the hands and feet. He was hung, if not entirely naked, certainly stripped of his outer garments, which were torn apart by soldiers that gambled for his clothing. Jesus was nailed to the cross in such a way as to create maximum difficulty in breathing. Most victims of crucifixion would die from asphyxiation. It means they couldn't breathe. The posture of the victim would force the diaphragm into spasm. The diaphragm here below the lungs, the muscle which helps your lungs contract, spasms. And so you would push up on the nails in your ankles and feet. You would push down on the nails in your wrist to try and get up to get breath, to relax yourself. But of course, doing that would cause you unimaginable agony. To describe this whole experience, a new word was created: excruciating, echoing crucifixion, excruciating. Once Jesus was on the cross, he spoke only a few times. His first words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," recorded in Luke 23. After this, he offered comfort and forgiveness to a criminal beside him who knew that he deservedly died. But Jesus told him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." He also instructed the disciple John, who had came up to the hill with his mother and some more of the women that followed Jesus. It's worth noting that John was the only one of his disciples there. The women were there, his mother was there, but only John remained from the disciples. And John had never spoken up at his trial. But Jesus turned to John and told him to care for his mother Mary. He said, "Son, behold your mother, mother, behold your son," as a way of making sure that after his death, Mary would be cared for. Shortly before he died, Jesus declared tetelestai, which is often translated, "It is finished." This is a phrase that would be written on contracts once it had been paid in full, completed in full. Jesus was declaring that the penalty of sin had been paid in full by his death on the cross. His last words were, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This was around the 9th hour. Jews would start the day at 6 a.m., and so this was around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Jesus breathed his last. At the very moment that he breathed his last breath, Jerusalem was shaken by an earthquake, and the temple veil that covered the most holy of holy places within the temple was torn from top to bottom in two. The Holy of Holies represented the dwelling place of God's presence. And this veil, although we picture sometimes in our minds a thin veil of some kind, would have been around 60 feet tall and 4 inches in thickness. This is a thick piece of material. It would be impossible to tear it from top to bottom by any human effort. A wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea, who had followed Jesus, approached the soldiers after his death, along with Nicodemus. Nicodemus, who we last heard of in John 3. He'd come to see Jesus by night in secret because he was afraid of what others would think, now comes to the cross as a Pharisee to help Joseph of Arimathea take down the body of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea donated his own family tomb for Jesus's body to lay in. They had to do this before Sabbath arrived, which was on that Saturday, and so they had to rush quickly before 6 p.m. So probably by 6 p.m., Jesus was laid inside that tomb. Probably had to forego many of the normal rituals that would take place because of Sabbath coming, and so his body was not probably dressed or cleaned the way that it could have been. And that's the way Good Friday ends, with the death of Jesus. Again, we call it Good Friday, and it is good for you and I. It is good for you and I, but let us grieve this together. In order for that goodness to come, Christ had to suffer. But I'll say this: we can sometimes grieve and see the pain of Jesus. But Jesus said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own free will." What happened on Friday was not forced upon Jesus by anyone. Nothing happened that day that Jesus didn't foresee. Nothing happened that was outside of his Father's control. In fact, he says to Pilate, as Pilate questions him, "You would have no authority over me other than that which is given to you by my Father." And I say this because I want you to understand that Jesus endured Friday's horror show because of his great love for you and I. A deep love, a committed love, a devoted love, which says, "I will suffer for my friends." Jesus had said earlier on Thursday at the Passover meal, "No greater love has this than for a man to lay down his life for his friends." Jesus laid down his life of his own free will for us. As I said at the start, there has been no greater display of love ever shown in the history of mankind than what happened on Friday. And that's why it is, despite the pain and suffering, good. Join me tomorrow as I look at Saturday. Again, at 6 p.m., we'll look at what happened in the interim. And then, of course, on Sunday as well, the best day of the week. I'll have a short summary there to recount the events. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate y'all joining in with this. I wish you a blessed Good Friday as you grieve and reflect upon the sacrifice of Christ. And may the Spirit be with you as you seek him.